So, I've now spent a semester here in Massachusetts. I've been studying quite a bit regarding history within the Eurasian sphere, and I just sort of wanted to put on note some of the thoughts I had. First off, the transition from studying philosophy to at this point history, though with the long-term goal of understanding current international relations, has proved to be somewhat of a more enlightening journey than I originally anticipated it to be. I will state that when it came to it, I did originally approach history as if it were sort of a problem in either philosophy or science, in that with science, it's simply if you don't know a fact, it's about discovering a fact. You conduct an experiment or you simply read the right material in order to determine whether or not there is a fact missing from your particular worldview. When it comes to philosophy, it's somewhat similar in that the construction of a worldview is very much part and parcel with the sort of writings of a particular philosopher, in that if you feel like there is a particular idea or concept that you find to be lacking from your own conception, then really it's just a matter of you read one more thing, you write out a few of the ideas, you have conversations with people, and the idea will manifest itself in some aspect. With history, I found there was a difficult new layer to what I was approaching, in that it's not as simple as you pick up another book, you pick up another article, you have another conversation. This isn't at all how history tends to construct information. And the biggest factor to this that I found is that facts in history themselves are actually quite understood. You can produce a letter, you can produce a piece of document, you can produce a newspaper article, and from there you can determine what happened, you can determine when it happened, you can determine who was involved with it. But there never really is a point where history tells you the how or the why. The how and the why of any historical inquiry proves to be the most challenging part of understanding history, in that you could point to two events that happened almost simultaneously. So for a very modern example, for something that might hit home to a number of people, we could say that the September 11th, 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center occurred, and then you have the 2003 US-Iraq War, which involved other members of NATO, but primarily was a conflict between Iraq and the US, which continued on for quite some time, and in retrospect has been somewhat of a disaster when it comes to US foreign policy. Now, it's very easy to point at these two events, state that the terrorist attacks of 2001 are directly connected to the US invasion of 2003. But is it really that simple? Can we say that the attacks that occurred on US soil is the specific catalyst that made the 2003 invasion possible? Or was there potentially groundwork that existed prior to that? Or was this an invention that happened after the attacks? This actually is still somewhat of a relevant question. And actually, there is quite a bit of disconcernment. There is quite a bit of disagreement over how strongly the 2001 attacks led to 2003, or whether or not 2003 would inevitably happen, but possibly at a later date, or for different justifications, or what have you. So that's a more modern example. We can also point towards the collapse of the Soviet Union within 1991, and the withdrawal of Soviet forces from Afghanistan in 1989. Again, somebody can point to these and it's like, well, it's 3 years apart, so of course these are connected ideas. These are connected events. But it may very well be that the Soviet involvement in Afghanistan really had very, very little to do with the fact that the Soviet Union was eventually going to dissolve. It could have happened quicker because of the failure that happened in Afghanistan, or it could have happened actually slower because Afghanistan provided justification for the Soviet Union to be an active player on the world stage. So there's a bit of discontentment when it comes to these sorts of questions. And again, the facts themselves are not the things in contention. Nobody is sitting there and stating that the withdrawal of troops didn't happen in 1989. Everyone agrees on that fact, but it usually is a question. If you're going to examine the withdrawal of Soviet troops, you're going to be engaged in discussions of like, how did the withdrawal itself come about? Why did the withdrawal itself come about? So again, it's very much similar but disconnected. It's a very different environment from engaging with philosophical inquiry or scientific inquiry, and I have found this to be quite enlightening in that, personally, I had been approaching history very much in sort of a scientific approach, in that, well, I just need to read more, I just need to understand more. But the more I read of history, the more I understand that the questions of history prove to be far more prevalent than I originally thought. It's not as simple as to state that an event happened and everyone knows why an event happened. And this becomes especially pernicious when we start to delve into questions prior to the 20th century. Once you start getting into the 19th century and before, historical inquiry is a quagmire that becomes far more integrated into other considerations. So as an example, one of the projects that I focused on was about the Kazakh hetmanate that had existed from roughly 1651 to approximately the 1760s. There's somewhat of a disagreement on when exactly you consider it dissolved, but for the most part, the works of Catherine the Great in order to bring in the Kazakhs into the full army of Moscow seems to be the definitive end that everyone agrees, at the very least, that was the dissolution. Some people actually argue it was dissolved 2 decades prior to that. That's not the important part. The important part is that when examining this, I originally approached it as a problem of just, oh, I'll find the right book. I'll just read this thing by this guy. I'll read this thing by that other guy. And then suddenly I'll just know what happened. The history will be laid before me and there won't be any question. Except then what I found myself is that the events in and of themselves regarding the Kazakh hetmanate play a major role in how modern Ukrainians view themselves. And it has especially played a role when, during the 1990s, Ukraine was attempting to find itself in a post-Soviet world. It was attempting to create its own identity, and politicians themselves would actually accuse each other of essentially making the same mistakes as the original Zaporizhian Kazakhs that they had made in 1654. There was a common phrase that would go around to politicians in stating that each one, if they signed a particular agreement with Russia, and off the top of my head I can't remember it, but there is an article that I have that I can put up that demonstrates the particular treaty that they were arguing about, in which some of the politicians that wished to sign the new economic treaty were actually, according to other politicians, signing a new Pereyaslav agreement. Were attempting to give up the sovereignty of Ukraine for economic or military sovereignty. Comfort. So much of this historical inquiry ties into modern questions of identity, of nationhood, of sovereignty, of how one can actually identify themselves within a historical sense. And while this is interesting, it certainly opened my mind into a sort of problem that has been occurring within the United States side of international relations, in that the United States doesn't view this historical lens. It doesn't spend a lot of time really understanding the deep sort of generational ties that some people will have when it comes to why the, for example, Russo-Ukrainian War, or why the protests in Georgia, or why the protests in Moldova, why the current overturning of the Romanian elections, any of these events play into generational fears that have to do with historical accounts regarding not just the Soviet Union, but the relation of these nations with previous kingdoms, with previous sovereignties, with the previous Russian Empire. And all of these play into sort of the modern national ideas that have been ongoing within each of these nations. And so the idea that we can just understand the history, or more importantly, that I can simply read portions of the history and understand these conflicts to the same degree, it was quite arrogant. I find myself looking back at how I approached this prior to the semester, and now I see myself digging into inviting the same sort of like chauvinistic ideas, and just, oh, I can understand the history in the same way that a Romanian can, or a Moldovan can. These examinations have certainly proved to myself that I really have had such a shallow view of history. And I find this to be very enlightening, especially now that I am in the process of pivoting a lot of this study, a lot of this inquiry into the more modern problems. So when we're talking about international relations, I have to pay attention to modern conversations, and that includes what people are talking about, both on the English-speaking side, but also the Russian-speaking side, and potentially the Ukrainian-speaking side, of which I don't have any skills in Ukrainian and barely any skills in Russian, I will say. But in noticing the difference in conversations between these sides, I do find that there is sort of a modern problem in that American policymakers, or more specifically American commentators, really don't have an appreciation for history in the same way that Ukrainians or Russians will. When we speak about the conflict that is currently ongoing in Ukraine and Russia, we speak about it in terms of international relations. And by this, what I mean is that we are talking about political alliances, we're talking about military alliances, we're talking about economic alliances. But we on the American side don't really bring up the historical significance of what these lands mean, how these people view themselves, and why it's so important for either Russia or Ukraine to define the lands of Ukraine as either historically Ukrainian or historically Russian. Meanwhile, commentators in Russia and Ukraine will focus almost entirely on the historical aspect. The current political, economic, and military problems are present. They will talk about those, but you have Vladimir Putin will put out an essay that titled "On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians" is designed entirely to create a false historical sense of what the connection is between Ukraine and Russia. And then not only is that published on the Kremlin website, it is integrated into the military as required reading. It is then propagated throughout several interviews. It is repeated by people like Dmitry Medvedev. This becomes not just an essay that Putin writes as a sort of his own project. This becomes a foundational aspect of the justification for current conflicts. The essay stands as a document to justify the historical aspect of why a conflict in the region wasn't just inevitable, but justifiable. And this is the main driving propagandic force. This is the main propaganda that is being perpetuated by Russia and has been broadcast primarily within the Eastern European section of we're committing to these military actions not because the United States or the EU or any of that. We're doing this because, quite frankly, these Ukrainian lands are actually Russian lands historically, and we are simply trying to rejoin what was originally one in terms of Malorussia and Novorussia. And so taking that into account, it very much is this stark difference between the conversation that is happening between different parties and their particular involvement in the war. Ukrainians are having to fight not just militarily, they're having to fight on an academic level. They're having to fight poor historical claims. They're having to fight against the rewriting of Ukrainian history from a greater force that has far more resources and greater capabilities in putting into the minds of potential allies such as what they've attempted to do in Poland, in Moldavia, in Germany, of actually Ukraine was originally part of Russia and we should be able to take that. And we don't have to deal with that as Americans. Americans don't think about the history of it. And there's good reason for that, there's bad reason for that. That's a whole discussion in and of itself. But coming to the realization that there are two distinct conversations in which you will hear American commentators just sort of talk about the entire conflict in terms of politics or economics, completely separate from the historical dilemma that people within the region have to grapple with. It really stands as a stark reminder that historical questions are not as simple as we've continued to put it at. And quite frankly, I'm glad I've gone through the semester that I have in essentially browbeating me, essentially smacking me across the face, and not only telling me that I've been approaching this sort of inquiry wrong, but that legitimately how I approach history has potential consequences. If I approach the region, if I approach the Eurasian region in terms of international relations, and I simply dismiss the historical record of any of this and dismiss the historical incongruencies that occur between nations within the region, then I am actively contributing to a sort of ignorance, naivety about the region that has proven to be quite damaging for international relations. So I'm quite grateful for this. I'm quite grateful to have my eyes open to the idea that, quite frankly, we do need to do more, not just to understand the region as an economic or military or political problem, but one of historical significance, one in which more time needs to be spent in understanding the deep historical roots and sense that contribute to modern identities, not just for Ukraine, not just for Russia, but other nations within the region, especially if we're speaking about regions such as Georgia, if we're speaking about Moldova and the ongoing crisis with Transnistria there, especially if we're talking about Romania and the recent elections that occurred there and the ongoing issue we're finding with that, as well as Poland. There was recently an agreement had between Poland and Ukraine about exhuming bodies that occurred during a genocide during the events of World War II. And this sort of historical unity between two people is far more prevalent within the region of multiple groups of people having to really grapple with their own past, having to grapple with who they are in the modern sense. And it's a very new identity that they find themselves having to reconcile with, a past that went through not just being victims of greater powers such as the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, but genuinely that very much their own people might have participated in atrocities. And coming to terms with that is not only difficult, it's not only difficult, it truly is astounding that it's astounding how isolated the American public really has been when it comes to the sense of grappling with their own historical. And certainly there are plenty of people can bring up that Americans have their own history that they have to grapple with, but certainly the average American doesn't have to deal with that history in the sense of an invading army. We don't have to deal with that history in the sense that there are neighbors that have genuine concerns about where we draw the borders. We don't have contested territory that has to sit there and be occupied by foreign groups and continually argued about. We don't have to deal with any of this when it comes to the American side. And so the American grappling with our own identity is very different, and much less important for determining modern conflicts and political agreements, political treaties. And this truly has been an eye-opening semester for me, and I'm quite grateful for it. I do look forward to now moving forward. I've certainly increased the amount of material I'm reading, but not because at this point, it's the same as when I began, where, oh, I'll just read this book and I'll know about this history. But now I'm actively approaching history in the sense of like, okay, what does this person say? What is the evidence that they're bringing forward? And sort of how does this connect and understand with other historical sources? What more can I understand? What sort of information do we have? And how can I best put together a picture of the region, not just in the current modern sense, but how does the history produce not just answers, but more likely questions and reconciliations that one has to grapple with in the modern sense. And so thankfully I am, I will say I am reading more than I have been probably ever in my life. Probably even more so than I was during like kindergarten. And I read a lot then. Of course, they only gave me 5 books, but yeah, I'll read those 5 books till the end of my life. But still, it's my hope is that over this next year, I really do not only take this and approach the region with a more robust understanding that my own historical sense is not going to match entirely with the historical sense of people in the region, but that I genuinely approach the problem with a sense of historical respect, with a respect to the history of each actor in the nation, not in the nation, in the region, each group of people, and really the questions that they have to grapple with themselves. And I can't say that I know them off the top of my head entirely, but at the very least, I feel like for the first time I'm somewhat pointed in the right direction when it comes to answering questions, in that I can't provide answers. I can't provide robust answers in my own right, but at the very least, I feel better equipped to ask the right question. Regardless, overall, these were just my thoughts now that I've ended the semester. The plan at this point is I'm going to be doing more of these, more of off the cuff rambles, more focused on just sort of getting my thoughts out, but I will continue to work on longer, more defined projects where there is a continual beginning question and an end answer. But that'll be for later. For now, I just wanted to make sure I got something out, make sure I'm back into the game of understanding that I can't just simply sit here and passively read material. I actually have to, I'm now at the point in my career that I have to be responsible for putting out material, for putting out actual information that I believe be helpful for others. And I hope that some of these rambles would actually prove to be helpful for some other people in the future. Quite frankly, if you want to learn more about what's going on, I would recommend Eugene, specifically when it comes to the national identities of Ukraine and sort of a more modern approach to it. I would recommend Intent to Destroy by Eugene Finkel. He has been an expert when it comes to anti-Semitism within the region for quite a while, but this was his first book in which he focused primarily on attempts to create the Ukrainian identity, and it's more specifically a direct response to Putin's essay. It is a very robust response to Putin's claims regarding Ukrainian identity over the last 200 years or so. And I would highly recommend it to anybody who has even a passing interest. Outside of that, for the most part, just, keep asking questions, keep doing what you do. I'm going to keep doing that, and I wish you luck.